welcome to another webinar with Richards and Jurusik Immigration Law. My name is Jeremy Richards, and I am one of the partners here at Richards and Jurusik. And our firm, we dedicate our practice only to U.S. immigration law, and we deal a lot with Canadians. That's our primary clientele is Canadians coming to live and work in the United States. And this is a continuing webinar based on the last one that we had. We're digging a little bit more into TN visas specifically for Canadians. And today we're going to talk about how to determine whether or not your job and your degree qualify you for TN status. And it's a lot more complicated than it might seem. I think people don't put enough thought into this when they're looking to work in the United States. It can be very simple depending what your occupation is, but it can also be quite complicated depending on your degree and what field you will be working in the United States. So as always with our webinars, we love questions. So if you do have questions that you want us to answer for you, general questions, if it's a more nuanced or specific to a personal legal situation, that's more fitting for a consultation. But if it's a general question about TNs and our topic, feel free to drop in a question in the chat, and we'll reserve time at the end to go over those questions for you. So today we will first talk about the degree requirements for TN. What do they accept when they're adjudicating a TN application? We'll talk about job titles and how important it is for your TN category and your job title. There must be an alignment there, as well as with your degree and the alignment between your degree and the position that you're doing in the United States. And we'll give some examples and talk about that as well. And what if your degree isn't in the field that you work in, and how that might complicate the process, as well as work experience in place of a degree. And that's very limited. TN is different than an H-1B. An H-1B has more latitude when it comes to using combinations of work experience and certificates and education, where TN is much more strict in that regard. And some common mistakes that we see in the TN application process, and things you should avoid if you're applying for a TN or preparing for the TN application process. Also, some of our upcoming webinars that we have that might be of interest, such as how to go from a TN to a green card. All right, now degree requirements. What's accepted? Most TN categories require at least a bachelor's degree. And if you're looking at the USMCA occupations list, it doesn't tell you the field of specialty for the occupation. It just says, for example, an accountant, you must have a degree in accounting. Or it doesn't say degree in accounting. It says a bachelor's degree or a license, a CPA, a CMA, or whatever the license is. And it doesn't explicitly state that that degree must be in accounting, but there are memoranda and clarifying memos from CBP that have told us that your degree must be closely related or in that specific field. So if you are working as an accountant, and I'll stick with that example, then you must have an accounting degree, a finance degree, something that's closely related to accounting. If you have a general business degree that is not specific to accounting, then a general business degree would not qualify as an accountant. And the degree must be directly related to the job being offered too. So you might have a degree in accounting, but the job in the United States is not related to that degree. Maybe your job in the United States is as a computer engineer, but you have an accounting degree. Well, there's not a relation between your degree and your education. You could be an amazing computer engineer, but without the right credentials, it doesn't matter how good you are at your job, there must be a match. And the institution from which you obtained your certificates or your degrees must be accredited institutions as well. Some categories do allow for alternatives where you could use a license in place of a degree, such as a lawyer or an architect, psychologist. There's other occupations where if you have a license and it's in one of the professions, the license could also qualify you in lieu of a degree, or vice versa. And then there are other ones where you can combine a diploma and experience to qualify, such as a hotel manager, management consultants. Management consultants are so broad you could use a degree or just experience. And we'll go into a little more detail on those as well. Your job title must match a TN category. So this can be difficult for HR representatives or for employers to understand. You might receive a job offer, and in that job offer, they can call you whatever they have an internal title for you for. Let's use Vice President of Computer Systems, and that may be their internal title. Well, there is no TN occupation for Vice President of Computer Systems. That's not an occupation under the TN occupations list. So when you are applying for a TN, it's important that you apply under the occupation that is listed under the TN occupations list. You're not applying for a job. And that's the way I try to explain it. This isn't a job application. You already got the job. Your employer, they gave you a job. They made you the job offer. That's all fine and dandy. Well, now we need to take that job offer that you were given, and we need to then compare it against the USMCA occupations list and then fit it into the proper occupation. And then whatever that occupation is what you apply under. You apply under that TN occupation. Again, you're not applying for a job. You're applying for a visa, and you have to properly classify yourself. And part of that classification is identifying the proper occupation under which you should apply. So your job title could be something crazy. Well, what, according to your duties, are you doing in the United States, and what occupation is that? So identifying the proper occupation in lieu of your job title is very important in order to do the TN process properly. So identifying the match between your duties and the occupation, and then applying for a visa under that occupation. Again, not a job under a job title. And you can see the full list of occupations with the QR code on the screen. There are several occupations. There's over 60 of them that you can look through to try to identify whether or not your job offer fits within one of those occupations. Just one second, we're having some computer complications here. All right, sorry about that. I got a phone call and it messed up everything during the process. All right, so um, let's see here. All right, and here's an example of occupations and the field of degree and how these things need to align. So for a computer systems analyst, for example, some degree fields that would potentially qualify you to work as a computer systems analyst in the United States under the TN classification would be a degree in computer science, a degree in information systems. Those types of degrees align with computer systems. So as long as it's a computer science related degree, then it's going to fit within the computer systems analyst education requirement and more than likely qualify you for a TN. Now, it gets a little more complicated than that, because then you also have to look at where you obtained the degree, what country did it come from, is it a 4-year degree, is it a 2-year degree, is it a certificate? But when you're talking about the field that the degree needs to be in, it has to be closely related to that occupation. So engineer, something in the engineering field. If civil engineering, mechanical engineering, computer engineering, All of those engineering categories would all slip in under the occupation of an engineer, an accountant. Having an accounting related degree or a license if it's required. And the thing about licensure with a TN application process is licensure is a post entry requirement. So a lot of times you can get the TN without a licensure, but then the state would mandate whether or not a license is required for you to practice in that occupation in the United States. Biologists, so a degree in biology or a closely related field. Economists, economics are closely related field. And I think you get the point here that the field there must be a correlation between the field of study and the occupation. There must be a match there. Management consultant, that one is broad. So it could be essentially in any degree that's related to a consulting agreement. So you typically see people with an MBA or people with a business degree that are consultants. But you could have a subspecialty that you consult in, and your degree and experience could be in this special field. We do a lot of oil field consultants, for example. Well, if you work in the oil field industry, you might have a related degree to that, as well as experience, and that could potentially qualify you as a consultant if you are in fact consulting. Um, So what if your degree is in a different field? And that's where TN applications can become complicated. Both CBP and USCIS expect there to be a clear link between your degree and the job. And it has to be in that occupation again. It has to be a match. Now, when they're looking at that, we typically use the 50% rule. So if you have a degree that isn't in a specific field but you want to argue that it does qualify you for an occupation, look at your transcripts, look at your course load. If you're trying to apply as a computer systems analyst and you have a degree in mathematics, that could potentially work depending on what your course load is. Mathematics and computer systems are closely related and generally seen as closely related. And you may have taken several computer related courses or courses in analytics or whatever it might be that would cross over to being a computer systems analyst. So looking at your transcripts to try to identify if more than 50% of your course load is directly related to that occupation, then it could potentially work. So trying to establish a clear link between that degree and the occupation. So looking at those transcripts in detail, some of the occupations that you can qualify based on work experience, well, you can't use a resume alone. A resume isn't proof of experience, it's self-attesting. You need to receive actual work experience letters from former employers that speak specifically to what you did during that time of employment, how long you were there, what your job title was, and what your duties were in detail, so that the officer can determine whether that experience would meet the qualification in those occupations where experience is acceptable. And make sure your job description is detailed and it's easy for the officer to be able to identify the connection between your experience, your education, and the duties you're going to be performing in the United States, and that those all clearly align under one of the TN occupations. And if you do have a foreign degree, and then you need an education evaluation. If it's not a US degree, if it's not from North America as the rule, then you would need a foreign equivalency of that degree to show what its equivalence is in the US education system. And you want that evaluated to a US degree. Okay. And if you have a job that crosses over or a job that could be classified as multiple different TN occupations, well, that can make it a little bit more complicated. You need to then look at your position. You need to identify what do you primarily do. You can't apply for multiple occupations, even if you might have subsets of different occupations in your role. You need to identify which one you primarily do. Now, are you more of a computer systems analyst or a computer engineer? What do you do the majority of your time? And identify what that is along with your education and determine which occupation is the best fit for you to apply under. And that can become complicating depending on what you are doing in the United States. So, looking very closely at your duties in your education to determine uh, what your actual field is very important. And making sure there's a match between those duties and your degree and the occupation for that you're applying under for the TN. Work experience in place of a degree. So there are only a few categories under the TN occupations that allow for work experience at all in order to help you qualify for a TN. Management consultant is the most common one. Because a management consultant, you can qualify as a consultant either by having a 4-year degree, having 5 years of experience as a consultant, or by having 5 years of experience in a specialty relating to a consulting agreement. Well, how do you prove those 5 years? You do that through experience. And again, that experience must be proven through former client or former employer letters that testify to that experience that you did gain, and be very specific about that experience and what you gained the experience in. And then you also have other categories: scientific technician, technologist, computer systems analyst, hotel manager, that also have a degree or a diploma or certificate plus experience component too. And there's graphic designer, and there's a few other ones as well, where you could also rely on potentially a diploma or certificate plus 3 years of experience. And it's important to note that when you're talking about diplomas, certificates, degrees, it's a North American education system that we're dealing with. So a diploma is a 2-year degree earned in Canada or the United States, and a certificate is a 2-year degree earned in Mexico. So when you're looking at your education and you're trying to align things and rely on experience plus that education component, you're not only worried about having the minimum education requirement, but you have to connect that with a proper degree, or else it won't work, even if you are using your experience. So, very important to have very detailed letters to support that, and to show your experience. And unlike an H-1B allows you to combine education, experience, certificates, and then equate it to a bachelor's degree or to whatever degree it is you're trying to prove that you have. The TN does not allow for that. You cannot combine degrees. You cannot combine a degree in education to meet the education requirement. Your education must, on its own, stand alone, be equivalent to whatever that requirement is for a TN occupation. You can't combine multiple degrees in education to meet that requirement. The only time you can use education is if the requirement for the occupation is a diploma plus 3 years of experience, or like a management consultant where you can rely on experience alone. If you're trying to apply for a TN as an engineer, well, you better have a degree in engineering or engineering license. You can't say you have a diploma in engineering plus multiple years of experience. You won't qualify. It's not an acceptable way, and you cannot combine your many years of experience and education to say that you meet that degree requirement either. Common mistakes that we see when people are trying to do the TN process. They assume that any degree will qualify. I think that's one of the most common. They'll look down the occupations list and it says, "Oh, you must have a 4-year degree." "Oh, I have a 4-year degree. I qualify." Again, no, your degree must be directly related to that occupation. So just by having a general business degree doesn't mean you qualify for all the TN occupations. Actually, a general business degree is one of the most difficult degrees to use to apply for a TN. You're really limited in what you might qualify for. You may potentially only qualify as a management consultant if you have a business degree. So you can't assume just because you have a bachelor's degree that you're going to qualify for a TN. It's not that simple. There must be a nexus between the degree and the occupation. If you can't show that they're closely related, then you potentially don't qualify for a TN. Also, applying in the wrong TN category. We see this all the time. And this goes back to the job title or job offer, where you may get a job offer in some crazy job title attached to that job offer, and then they don't properly classify it for the TN occupation that it fits under. Oh, or even applying under a job title. That is one of the major mistakes that we've seen, because if a border officer can't then decipher what your actual occupation is for TN visa purposes, then they're going to refuse you or deny you because they can't classify you under the occupation. And having a wrong job title or choosing the wrong occupation is a big mistake that we see people make. Also, insufficient documentation of your qualifications. It's up to you to bring proof of how you qualify, which means in most cases, you're bringing your original certificates, you're bringing your original degrees, you're bringing those former employer letters with you. You need to prove to the border officer that you have those minimum requirements, that you meet those qualifications. And that is done in some cases. People bring their diploma in a frame to the inspection process, and that is required. You are required to bring your originals with you. And you need to prove every qualification in order to meet that the requirements to get that TN. And this last one's probably my favorite. Excuse me. I have my fan on, my heater, and I'm burning up, so I had to turn that off. Using a management consultant as a catch-all. And we see this all the time. I had a conversation with an individual yesterday around this topic. The person had a job offer in the United States, clearly not a TN occupation. It's in a managerial position for a company. And they're like, oh, let's just apply as a management consultant. Well, no, that's not how it works. Management consultant is a very specific field, a very specific occupation. And it's very narrowly defined as to what a management consultant is. So just calling yourself a management consultant because you don't have a degree or because your occupation is in the occupations list is one of the most fatal things you can do when applying for a TN. And that's why the management consultant is one of the most notoriously scrutinized TN applications that you can see, is because there's so much abuse and so much fraud under that management consultant category. People want to work in the US so desperately and want to get this TN that they will put down on paper whatever they need to in order to convince a border officer that they're consulting in the United States. So be very careful. It's not a catch-all category. It's a very specific occupation, and you shouldn't be applying as a management consultant unless you are in fact a management consultant and meet the requirements for that as well. All right, so it looks like we're coming to the end here. So we have some upcoming webinars just to make you aware of. TN visa to green card, how to transition to a U.S. permanent residency while you're on a TN. One of the most common questions that we receive, and we do these a lot. So that's a very good webinar. If you have any questions about how you transition from your TN over to a green card, we'll be discussing that. And then after that, we will have one that discusses specifically traveling to Canada if you have a DUI or a criminal record, and how do you get it back into Canada. And that more specifically applies to U.S. citizens that are traveling to Canada that may have one of those convictions on their record. All right. Before we end, we do have some questions that we're going to answer for you, but in the meantime, you see the QR code and our contact information on the screen. So if you do have any questions about U.S. immigration or TN specifically, and how to determine whether or not you qualify for a TN, reach out to us. We do these all the time for Canadians, and we'd be glad to assist you. So I'm going to go down the questions here and see if there's ones here that are pertinent to our conversation and try to answer those for you. So a Bachelor of Computer Applications, does that qualify for a TN? So a Bachelor of Computer, again, it's more complicated than just the degree. You have to look at the job offer you have in the United States as well. So a Bachelor of Computer Applications, I'm going to assume that's a 4-year degree. If it's a 4-year degree or equivalent to a US 4-year degree, then that could potentially qualify under a computer systems analyst is probably where that's going to fit. It comes down to the duties as well. What are you actually doing? But a Bachelor of Computer Application sounds like it's a computer-related degree, computer science-related, which would typically qualify as a computer systems analyst, assuming that's a 4-year degree or equivalent to a U.S. 4-year degree. It was a 3-year degree? A 3-year degree does not qualify. So if it's a 3-year degree, that's where we see a lot of issues with TN applications. 3-year degrees do not meet the requirement. So if the Bachelor in Computer Applications is a 3-year degree, unfortunately, that does not qualify for TN status. It also doesn't qualify as a diploma or certificate. It doesn't meet the 2-year requirement either, because a diploma and certificate, those must specifically be from Canada, the United States, or Mexico. So if your degree was earned outside of North America and it's a 3-year degree, in most cases, that does not qualify for TN status. So a Bachelor of Pharmacy from India worked as a pharmacy assistant in the US. Does that qualify? Now, I would have to look specifically at the degree again and what its US equivalency is. If the degree is equivalent to a Bachelor of Pharmacy or a pharmacy degree in the United States, it could potentially qualify. That degree would have to be evaluated for sure for its US equivalency before even attempting a TN application. So if you do have a foreign degree, and these are good questions, the first step you should do is get a US equivalency for your degree. Determine what the equivalency is first. I can't give you an equivalency. That's not what we do. We work with professional organizations that do that do provide US equivalencies. So if your degree was not earned in Canada, United States, or Mexico, the first thing you should do before attempting any US immigration is get that degree evaluated for its US equivalency. And make sure when you get those evaluations that they're just evaluating each degree independently. Do not combine degrees. Have them look at that independent degree for its US equivalency in order to be used for TN application purposes. We have a specific question. If somebody had an issue, let's see, who's denied for TN. So this person is just asking about the TN application process and the treatment that they received, and said that the border officer was rather rude. They denied the visa, fingerprinted them, took their photos, treated them, and they made them feel like a criminal. Is this normal? Unfortunately, yes, it is. Very unprofessional. I would agree it's unprofessional. Border officers are not there to provide good customer service, okay? They're government employees. They're seeing themselves as protecting the United States, protecting the borders, protecting the US labor market, and they can often be very rude and disrespectful, and they don't care. They don't care that you have a good day. They don't care that you have a good experience. So unfortunately, we see a lot of poor treatment in the application process. There's a lot of details that I'd like to know about, that interaction and why that person was denied. If they're threatening you with jail time and things like that, oftentimes we see that. Oftentimes those are idle threats from a border officer. They don't often do that unless there's justification for it. Are you committing an immigration violation? Do you have a criminal record? Those are the things that typically are going to lead to something that drastic. Simply applying for a TN and not qualifying doesn't raise to that level. Unless you're committing fraud or deception, then that's a crime and that could get you in trouble. But simply applying for a TN and not qualifying, they should just turn you away and tell you to come back with proper documentation, or that you just don't qualify. But unfortunately, oftentimes that comes with poor treatment. So this individual is an individual is asking a question about a future employer who wants to hire them as a consultant, but the role is really a project manager. So project manager is not a consultant. Those are completely different occupations. but it also goes on to talk about some more details about their degree. I would say that individual specifically, you're probably better off providing more details about the situation. And that could potentially be a consultation where we could go into detail about how that might be possible. But I will say that a management consultant and a project manager, completely different. That's not a project manager is not a management consultant. So I'll clear that up right away. Management consultant is a completely different occupation. So if you have a job offer from a consulting company, do you need to have an MBA for a TN visa as a management consultant, or would a US degree in business economics suffice? That's an excellent question. So management consulting is broad. So you can qualify in various different ways as a consultant. I would say an MBA is probably one of the best degrees you can have if you're saying you're a consultant. That's a catch-all degree. But you could also qualify with a degree in economics. You could also qualify with a degree in accounting or business. It really depends on what you are you consulting on, and can you argue that that degree qualifies you as a consultant. The other benefit as a management consultant is you can also rely on experience. So even if you have a degree that's not completely related to consulting, but you have experience as a consultant or you have experience in an industry related to a consulting agreement, there's a lot more latitude to prove qualifications as a management consultant if you are in fact consulting. So even though management consultant can be one of the more complex occupations to apply under, if it is done correctly and you in fact qualify and you in fact are a consultant, then there's a lot you can do to qualify somebody as a management consultant. So this person's asking again about a consultant and how entry level positions at a consulting firm may not involve actual consulting. Well, that would still be consulting. So, for example, if you're working at a KPMG, a Deloitte, or a consulting company, they have analysts, they have other individuals within the organization that are a part of their consulting system that still could be classified as consultants. So that's one where we would look closely at the duties. What are you actually doing on this job? What is your education, to see if we can still fit it in as a consultant? You might be able to, because those are roles of a consultant, providing that analysis and the background work. It could potentially still be qualified as consultant. That's another good question. So can you qualify for a TN with an unrelated bachelor's degree and a related master's degree? The answer is yes. They will look to that seminal degree. So the more advanced degree, they're going to look at that. So if you have a master's in computer systems, but then you have a bachelor's in business, yes, you could potentially still qualify as a computer systems analyst if you have a master's in computer systems. We see that happen a lot. Where maybe later on, after a degree, people change professions and they go back for more education that's directly related. So, yes, that is possible. Higher degree also satisfies the requirement. I just answered that. Yes, typically, if you have a higher degree, it will meet the requirement of a lesser degree. So, master's in computer science and engineering, will that meet the computer systems analyst category? Yes, and I'll say with a caveat, I need to know what country these degrees are from, and if they're outside of the United States, make sure you have an equivalency done, so that you can determine that that's equivalent to the proper U.S. degree. Is fingerprinting normal? Yes, it's quite normal. When you get approved, you get your fingerprints taken. If you get refused, oftentimes they can take your fingerprints. I would say when you're getting refused and they're taking your fingerprints, though, there's two types of refusals. One's a soft refusal where they're like, you know what, we just don't think you're qualified. This job doesn't qualify. We can't give you the visa. When they're fingerprinting you, I would say it's more of a hard denial, where they really don't think you qualify or they had a problem with your application, and they're making sure that they track you and they take your fingerprints for that purpose. They also take your photograph, and oftentimes they'll take a statement from you as well. When you get to that point, then it's typically seen as a more it's a hard denial is what I would call it. And if you have one of those, you need to be careful before you reapply. Figure out what happened in that situation and make sure you cure that before you go back to a port of entry. And keep in mind when you're applying for a TN, it could impact your travel as a visitor too. So be careful before you just show up and apply for a visa at a port of entry. Make sure you have the proper documentation. Make sure you go through this exercise to determine if you're applying under the proper occupation, because it'll have long term consequences on your ability to visit the United States as well. So be very careful. Every interaction that you have at a port of entry is recorded. It may not seem like it, but they record it, especially if they're refusing. They're taking copious notes and they're going to refer to those. They'll scan your documents, they'll have records of all of this. So be careful. Have a TN visa and come to the US to meet my parents and told on border that I'm not sure if I understand this question. Can I work remotely from my parents' house to work on my TN? Good question. Remote work. So you cannot, so let's say you're Canadian and you work for a Canadian employer and your employer allows you to work remotely. You cannot come to the United States and get a TN to work remotely for your Canadian employer. It does not allow for a digital nomad visa or remote work. If you're getting a TN, that job must have a U.S. client or must be a U.S. employer and must have actual on-site duties for you to perform. You must have part of your function attending meetings or client site visits or whatever it might be. It doesn't allow for 100% remote work, and it absolutely does not allow for remote work from Canada. You can't do that. Yes, you can study in the United States when you're on a TN, as long as your TN is your primary purpose. So that's how you determine whether or not that's acceptable. So if you're working in the United States, well, work is your primary purpose for being here. Well, can you study part time on the side while you're on a TN visa? Absolutely, you can do that. If, however, study becomes your primary purpose, that's when you'd probably jump to a student visa instead. Is it better to apply from a land border or from an airport through pre-clearance? I'd say neither is better than the other. Okay, it's the same process. It, if I'm reading into that question, there are um, I think advantages to a land port over an airport, and then there are also some advantages to an airport over a land port. And it really comes down to your specific application. What is your occupation? What is your education? And then determining based on all of the factors which one works best in your situation. Some people have no reservation sending them to a land port. Some people, I tell them to avoid a land port and go to an airport. Some people, I say, don't go to the airport or a land port. You need to file by mail with USCIS ahead of time. So that's a very difficult question to answer. It's very fact specific. But if I were to answer it in general, well, in general, if you have the right documentation, you're qualified for TN status, then there's no reason you shouldn't be able to apply at a land port or an airport. A TN is multiple entry. So once you have your TN, that means you can travel back and forth to the United States as much as you want. There's no limit on your travel back and forth. Um, in another remote work question, yeah, remote work, that's a tricky one. You can't work remotely in the US on a TN for a foreign employer, if that's what that question is. Even if you can work primarily remotely in the United States for your US employer, it still needs a component of in person um, work as well.
3 questions.
I think I covered all of them here. There's different ones. All right, we got some other questions.
School teacher is eligible for TN visa.
So school teacher. So the only teachers that qualify for TN are college, university, and seminary. In the U.S. education system, that means anything under college or university doesn't qualify. So if you're high school or elementary school, that does not qualify for TN. It has to be college level or above, or a seminary teacher.
Yeah. Lawyers for TN visa for lawyers, plus the person have to pass the state or US state bar exam to be able to apply.
So if you want to be a TN as a lawyer, the requirement is to have a law degree or a license. You don't have to have both. We actually have an individual who works for us who's a Canadian citizen who works for us as a lawyer who does not have, who is working on passing the bar and has not yet passed the bar, but the requirements are an or. So you can have the degree or the licensure and still qualify as a lawyer. So you don't have to be a licensed lawyer. You would have to have a license to, sign off on paperwork and appear in court, but that's a state requirement. That's not a federal requirement. So for the TN, a degree is not required to get, or not a degree. For the TN as a lawyer, a license is not required in order to get the TN.
And fully online degrees are accepted as formal degrees of education.
In an online degree, as long as it's from an accredited institution and it's fully recognized as a bachelor's degree according to accreditation requirements, that could also qualify. All right, a lot of good questions. We thank you for tuning in and providing us your time and submitting your questions. It's always good to answer your questions and help you with your immigration matters. If you do have anything specific, a specific situation, then it's typically best to schedule a consultation so that we can address that for you. Thank you for tuning in, and again, click on the QR code if you need to contact us, and tune into our upcoming webinars about how to go from a TN to a green card, as well as entry to the United States with a criminal or DUI conviction. Thank you for tuning in, and you have a great day.